to introduce our speaker today, Deborah Hileman. She's president and CEO of the Institute for Crisis Management, one of the first firms in the U.S. to specialize in crisis management and communications planning, training, and consulting services. A globally certified strategic communication management professional, business leader, trainer, coach, and consultant with more than 35 years of experience in public and private companies and nonprofit organizations, Hileman has led high-performing teams in numerous industries. She understands crisis, earning a reputation as a trusted strategist and advisor to board members and C-suite executives, operations leaders, and other organizational stakeholders. She's also a longtime member of PRSA, and she served on nonprofit organization boards and is past chair and current board member of the Global Communications Certification Council. So with that, welcome, Deb, and we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. So yeah, she mentioned a few things about me. I've actually been a communications professional for 40 years now. My history with PRSA goes back more than 40 years, though. I actually was in PRSA during most of my college experience. And as I shared with Megan a little bit earlier before we got started, a fun anecdote. Many of you, if you studied PR in school, have probably heard the name Edward L. Bernays. He was the father of public relations, really defining what our profession is more than 100 years ago. And I actually met him at a PRSA conference back in 1980. Sad to say that it was at a late night drinking party sponsored by my chapter, but I actually have photographic evidence. So it's just an interesting little thing that tells you that basically I know a bunch of stuff and I'm really old, but I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. So I want to cover a number of things. I want to kind of set the stage and talk about what today's environment looks like for us, the social political environment, the communications environment, talk a little bit about the common characteristics of various kinds of crises, how we define a crisis. Then I'm going to dig into some of the various kinds of tools and tech that are out there that can help us to do a better job in communicating in crisis situations. And we will have plenty of time at the end for some Q&A as well. But just to kind of set the tone about the current environment, as we all know, we are living in a time of significant political turmoil here in the United States, but it's not unique to us in the US. We're seeing a lot of political turmoil really all over the world. Lots of very important elections going on in democracies all over the world this year. So we're seeing a lot of upheaval that impacts how organizations manage crisis situations. Democracies are becoming more secular, although we're seeing some pushback, at least in this country, from the right on that. We've seen a lot of erosion of trust. And if any of you are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, right? This year it pointed out that there's a lot of erosion of trust. We don't trust our governments. We don't trust big media. And certainly that impacts how well we can connect with our stakeholders when we are trying to communicate during a crisis. Lots of social activism going on. More and more we expect business leaders to take a public stand on issues. And that is a position that most CEOs are very uncomfortable with, especially in the public sector, publicly traded companies, right? The CEO's job is to make a good return for the investor. It is not to take a stand on social issues. So a lot of these folks are really grappling with how to address this push and demand on taking a stand on things. And employees are a lot more willing to speak up too, right? And call things out if they don't think that the company is doing things the way that they ought to be done. So here's how I define a crisis. And a crisis can be big, it can be small, it can start as a problem that's not addressed, but it is a significant event, or in some cases can be a series of events that if they're left unmanaged, if they are ignored for whatever reason or another, they threaten the company, they threaten the brand, they threaten a reputation that can take decades to build, they can threaten operations, and certainly can hit the bottom line. And these kind of events really require an immediate and very strategic approach from the team's management to mitigate, right? To stop the bleeding, to stop whatever is happening, and then to restore the organization to get back to whatever post-crisis normal is going to be, right? But moving towards that long-term recovery. We don't just say regular normal, because we all learned during COVID that today's normal is quite different than what normal looked like for all of us in 2019, for example. So it's whatever that new post-crisis normal is going to be. Every crisis is unique. They all have different things about them depending on how they occur, but they have a lot of things in common. In most cases, they're actually not a direct threat to life or property. They are not bomb cyclones or weather events or natural disasters. They are very often these smoldering kinds of problems that tend to grow into full-blown crises. Very often they're complex, they're not easy to break down and understand, but they can really rattle an organization and really threaten the company's norms and values. There may not be any one good response or solution. Every potential solution may have its own set of consequences. Things can become very politicized and subject to intense media scrutiny. We certainly saw this back during President Trump's first term in office, where company leaders were quaking in their boots if he tweeted something negative about their company because they saw their stock take an immediate dive. I think we'll see some of that going forward in the next administration, but I don't think it's going to be as intense as it was for organizations back then, because now we have a much better idea of what to expect. But crises almost always really challenge the brand. They challenge reputation. They put an awful lot of demand on the crisis management team and folks to be able to continue their day-to-day work in addition to trying to manage and resolve a crisis. And very often they put you in a defensive posture where you've got to be able to defend the decisions that have been made that may have led to the crisis. So when we talk about managing crisis, kind of comes down to what I call minding the reputation risk gap. And what that is the difference between what we have a legal right to do, and in some cases, what is the bare minimum that we can do to be complying with the law, versus what's the right thing to do, all right? What is the ethical thing to do? And I'm sure we've all been, involved in various crises that raise these kind of important questions. And as we all know, things can be perfectly legal and still not be moral or ethical. So we have to walk a very fine line between what is that minimum that we have to do to make sure we are staying straight with the law versus what is really the right thing for us to do for our stakeholders in the midst of this crisis. So why should we use technology for crisis communication? Communication is a very human thing, right? And we all like to believe that our human judgment is the most important component of crisis communication, and it certainly is a critical component. And I am of the belief that artificial intelligence, AI tools, are not going to replace us as communicators, right? But it's on us to make good use of technology and artificial intelligence as tools to help us be better communicators. So those of us that learn and use the tools, right, are going to get ahead from a career perspective. And if we don't adapt and start using the tools, then we may fall behind. Because these tools can help us work smarter. They can help us move more quickly, help us understand very complex concepts. Because our stakeholders want things from us and they want them very quickly. Crises may be hard to identify early on, but these tools are really important for us to be able to respond in an efficient manner to things that we might not expect. And we need to protect our reputation and make sure that we are owning the narrative, right, of what is going on with our crisis, rather than being in a defensive posture because we have sat back, we have not communicated, we have not owned our narrative, and we have allowed others to talk on our behalf. So we really can use technology to help us keep ahead of all these things that are driving the need for response. And let's face it, emergencies, crises, they're getting more complex. They're becoming more frequent. It's really hard to keep up sometimes, but if we have the right tools in place, that can really help us move very quickly to respond at a level that our stakeholders expect, right? And they can even improve our response times quite a bit. So if something happens, it used to be that it might take hours or days before we were prepared to respond. Now, by effectively using technology, in addition to having a sound crisis communication plan, we can move a lot faster, right? In some cases, by up to 25% faster. So a little bit about generative artificial intelligence, generative AI. AI offers us some pretty powerful tools. There are a number of different platforms out there that you can experiment with. But one thing that we need to think about is if we're going to start using artificial intelligence, we have to make sure that our organizations are ready for that and that we have put some policies in place to govern how AI is used, basically to make sure that we are using it in an ethical manner. Very important, but that can help really promote innovation across our organizations while at the same time making sure that we are effectively managing risks and we are allowing for that to change and grow as the technology advances. So the tech can do things like monitor the dark web for us, right? And find out whether or not any of our organization's data has shown up on the dark web. It can monitor all of our social platforms. It can very quickly detect patterns or trends in all of our social media coverage and all of our traditional media coverage that might be a very early indicator for us that something is happening. There's a threat emerging, and it's something that we need to look at very quickly and be able to respond to. And certainly the technology can do that a lot more quickly than we could as humans. Then there are natural language processing tools. These are great for crunching data and really helping us kind of better understand the information that's out there. But it can also help us identify misinformation much more quickly and effectively and be able to make sure that we're getting the facts out there and pushing back on any mis or even disinformation that may be out there. Then there's chatbots. I imagine a lot of your companies are already using chatbots. They integrate very well with customer relationship management systems. They can help automate a lot of the communications, the messages that you may need to send out across multiple channels in a crisis situation. And then there's machine learning tools, right, that can help model for you, model various crises and test some response strategies. So things like IBM Watson and Azure Machine Learning. You can provide it with a scenario, right, a model scenario, and the tools will actually go in and assess it and come back and say, here's all the different ways that this crisis may unfold. And here's what might happen if you respond in this way. So they're really great for identifying all the various different variables that could happen with any crisis that might come up. And they're really, really valuable in terms of helping us refine our crisis management strategies and our crisis communication plans as well. A lot of communication platforms that you're already using day in and day out, either personally or professionally, are using artificial intelligence in a number of different ways, and you may or may not be familiar with these. Facebook, right? It's using facial recognition technology. So if you see something in your Facebook feed that pops up and suggests that it wants to tag you in a photo, for example, it's using that AI to do that. It's also using deep text searches to monitor comments and posts and figure out where the trends are going, because all the algorithms that are built in there, right, all identify what you're already looking at and what you are interacting with on the platform in order to deliver more of the same to you. X, formerly known as Twitter, a lot of us still call it Twitter and we still call it tweeting. But they are using that same kind of artificial intelligence, right, to determine recommendations, right? You know, here's what you should tweet about. And they're also using IBM Watson as a moderator. As you know, X fired a bunch of their moderators, a lot of the humans that were moderating content on the platform, and they're using the artificial intelligence technology instead to monitor offensive posts, right? To remove inappropriate content, things that might have violated community standards. Instagram, right? They can filter spam with their AI, and they use it in a similar way to detect and remove hate speech and episodes of cyberbullying. And TikTok. Who knows if TikTok's going to still be here a year from now, but I have a feeling that it's probably still going to be here. And it's also using algorithms and artificial intelligence to deliver recommendations for various videos for you to watch. But it's also tracking your behavior, right? And it knows what you're looking at and the kinds of things that you want to view, because again, it's going to deliver up more of the same. So as you're putting together a communication strategy for a crisis, it's really important to know how these different platforms that you may be using, how they are categorizing the information that you're putting out there and what they may be doing behind the scenes that is going to either help push your information to the top of someone's feed, or it's going to make it drop off completely. So I want to talk a little bit about risk and vulnerability assessment and how technology feeds that as well. It's really best practice, if you are going to write a crisis communication plan, to start with a risk and vulnerability assessment. We need to understand where the risks are for an organization in terms of potential crises. What types of events are the most likely to happen? What types of events would be the most damaging, the most impactful if they were to happen? And that can be anything from knowing that if you are on the Pacific coast, that you may have bomb cyclones and tsunamis and earthquakes and various different kinds of natural hazards that you need to plan for. But it also may be things that are related to the culture of the organization and how the very culture puts the company at risk. And so when we are assessing vulnerability and using that technology, it's really an ongoing process that we like to see, with a lot of different data points and sources that are feeding into the tools that we're using to assess all of these different things going on with an organization. We want to gather input from a really broad cross-section of people across the organization. We need to be able to assess both probability and impact. And when we're doing that, we generate a matrix so that we can aggregate all the data and show our clients which types of crises their leadership team are most worried about, what keeps them awake at night, and which ones are we going to recommend that we write crisis communication plans and playbooks for. And that's where it also becomes very important to really learn about and understand the culture of the organization, and importantly, how that culture may drive the way that senior leadership behaves and the way that they communicate in terms of that reputation risk gap. So are you in a culture that is focused on doing the bare minimum to comply with the law? Is it a shoot the messenger kind of a culture? Or is it a culture of transparency and honesty and wanting to be able to share as much information as possible, as quickly as possible in a difficult situation? So in risk assessment, a lot of tools out there that can help us with mitigating risks, managing risk programs, being able to really monitor situations as they're going on out there and analyzing them, comparing them to a database of known risks and figuring out where they might fall on that risk scale, being able to identify what those risks might be. What is the company's tolerance for risk, right? Is it a risk-averse organization, or is it like many technology companies, not risk-averse at all? They are all about trying out and taking big risks in the hope of big reward. But also, how are you remediating risk? How are we minimizing risk? And is there any third-party involvement? Typically, the technology that we're going to use for risk assessment, risk mitigation, comes from an outside source. And then a big one here, information technology and security risks, right? And that is cybercrime, ransomware, the dark web, all the various places that our data may end up, and what are we doing to understand and mitigate the risk that the company has out there. But the other thing too is because when we're developing a crisis communication strategy, we can't know how we need to communicate. What are our key message points going to be if we don't know what our stakeholders already know or already believe about our organization, right? We need to have that starting point because we may need to write some persuasive content, right? To help people take actions that they might need to take in a crisis situation, or to believe what we want them to believe, right? We may be trying to influence stakeholder behaviors and stakeholder thoughts. So we categorize these vulnerabilities in 3 buckets. We have operational threats. These are the kind of things that kind of literally shut the factory down, right? Whether it's a natural disaster, some kind of a safety issue, an accident in the plant. It may be cyber, could be product defects. Think Boeing when it comes to that, and a number of other things. Then we have personnel and facility threats, and those are things that are typically what I call people behaving badly crises. So workplace violence, casualties, injuries on the job. There might be bomb threats or civil disturbances happening outside our workplace, or worst case scenario, an active shooter situation. Then lastly are what we call the reputational threats. And these are also those people behaving badly type of threats. But they are also the ones that tend to be most likely overlooked or not addressed in some form or fashion by management. So allegations of wrongdoing, losing a key executive, rumors, litigation, all kinds of different things that if left unaddressed are going to explode from a problem or an issue within the company. They are going to become a full-blown reputational crisis. So these are the different things that we want to understand as we are doing that environmental scanning and looking at risk and behavior in an organization before we write a crisis communication plan. There's a number of different platforms to consider, and this is, kind of the tip of the iceberg for you. And I don't know, some of you may be familiar with Shel Holtz. He's been in our profession for a long, long time. He's known as an expert on technology and communication. And these are part of a list that he had put together not too long ago. So you have language learning models. I use ChatGPT. It has a free version and a paid version. I use the paid version. It only costs $20 a month. And the big difference between the two is that the paid version is using newer data. When I first started using ChatGPT, I used the free version, and very often I would pose a question to it and it would come back and tell me that the most recent data that it had was from 2021. And so when I went to the paid version, I was getting much more recent data, much more relevant data for the things that I was asking ChatGPT to do. Anthropic has another tool called Claude, very similar to ChatGPT. And Google, of course, has their Gemini. So these are good for writing drafts of things, for example, and kind of getting ahead of various kinds of checklists or things that we need to put together for various crisis plans. But they're really great for drafting media statements and talking points, draft versions, of course, because we still have to humanize them. But then there are a number of image generators out there as well. If you need photographs, and I bet all of you notice as much as I do, if you're looking on social media, especially, you can tell which images were generated through artificial intelligence because the faces just look too perfect, right? We all know that we don't look very good in HD when we're on a big screen, but these images that these generators come up with are flawless, absolutely beautiful. But if you need particular kinds of images for a campaign that you're putting together, these image generators can be very handy to help you do that. So you've got Midjourney and then DALL-E 3, which you can get to through ChatGPT. All you have to do is tell it you want to generate an image. And then one called Stable Diffusion 3. There are also video generators out there. A couple of those to note, Luma Labs and HeyGen are used quite a bit to generate video. And lastly, on this page, a research tool. I love Perplexity. I use Perplexity and ChatGPT often side by side. Perplexity for me is Google on steroids, because one of the things that it does is not only does it come back with good information when you ask it to research something, but it also gives you all the sources that it used. So let's look at a couple of examples. So here's Perplexity. And so what I asked Perplexity to do was to identify potential risks to security measures in the workplace, or rather kind of a general ask. It came back and said, okay, here's the sources that I found for your question. And then it gave me an answer. And then it went through and gave me these great bulleted lists of all these different potential kinds of risks, including employee-related risks, insider threats, device and network vulnerabilities, equipment failure, cyber attacks. But even better, it took it a step farther. Then it came back and gave me some suggested mitigation strategies for the risks that it had identified. And then lastly, it gave me another list of other questions that I might want to ask it to give me additional or even more highly targeted responses. So this I find really, really handy when I'm trying to do some quick research, trying to put together some information for a client on what should we be worried about this pending situation. It's a great tool for that. Then ChatGPT and the other natural language processors. So here I asked it to draft a media statement for a manufacturer recall of tainted tomatoes. Now you'll notice I misspelled the word manufacturer. Now, unlike when we're trying to do a search and it has to be letter perfect exact, ChatGPT didn't care about the typo. And it came back and gave me what I asked for anyway. And so it gave me this draft media statement, kind of a fill in the blank media statement. And then I went back and said, okay, well, that's not bad, but okay, refine it and give me the recall information in the first paragraph instead of in the last paragraph, and make sure that there's a compassion statement in the second paragraph. So you can tell it to go back and edit and refine in the way that you want it to. And it works very, very well. But as I say, this is not a replacement for human judgment. This is a tool that can help us work more effectively, more quickly, more efficiently when we are trying to respond in a crisis situation. Interesting anecdote, though. I did a lecture last week for a business class at the University of Notre Dame, and it was a crisis comms class, and they all have projects that they have to do, putting together crisis plans and talking points and stuff for a fictitious crisis that they come up with. And I assess their plans and give them some feedback and things to think about on their projects. Well, they had one was a fictitious crisis with Nike where Kobe Bryant's shoes failed, some new brand of shoe, and it failed and he was injured on the court. So I went into Perplexity and asked it to draft something for me. And it came back and basically said, we're not going to do that. It's not ethical. It said, I'm not going to create possible misinformation from a fictitious scenario. Well, that was very interesting. So I took the same request over to ChatGPT. ChatGPT had no such qualms about ethics, and it gave me exactly what I asked for. So a word of caution when you're using these kinds of tools, though, do not put in any kind of proprietary or confidential data about your organization, because then that becomes part of that greater data universe out there. So you have to use it in a very generic way in order to get these kind of jump starts, if you will, on the things that you need to be writing. But things that you don't want to end up out in the cyberverse or the metaverse, don't ever drop them into these tools. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we measure response and the tools that we use there as well. Measuring response, this is a very important component of crisis communication in particular, because we need to know whether or not our messaging is really hitting the target. And so we need baselines to measure against. right? And there are a lot of different measures that we can use, both quantitative and qualitative. But we want to measure human impact, but we also want to measure the business impact of how we are responding to the crisis. But also knowing that the things that we do and the actions that we take speak a lot more loudly than the messaging that we put out there. But we still have to do both, right? We have to walk the walk and we have to talk the talk. So there's always opportunity to do better, even in the midst of a crisis. There are always opportunities within the response to that crisis that are going to help us. So what we want to ask ourselves is, what is it we want to achieve by responding to this crisis, right? What are our mitigation efforts supposed to do for us? Are we going back to yesterday's normal, or are we recognizing that yesterday's normal is gone and it's going to be tomorrow's normal? And if that's the case, then what does tomorrow's normal look like, right? Because then we want to devise a response strategy that is going to help us get to that tomorrow's normal that we've identified. And by having those baselines as well, then we're going to be able to measure our success against those objectives that we set. In terms of communication measures, a lot of different things we can do. And I'm sure all of you are using tools like Cision, critical mention, agility. There are a number of tools out there, social mention, that are all utilizing technology and to a great extent, some artificial intelligence as well, to help us measure our response. So we want to measure engagement. How well are our stakeholders interacting and engaging with the content that we are putting out there for them? One of the things we can look at is our website traffic. If you have put up a dark page on your website during the crisis, and if it is a crisis that has a lot of public communications associated with it, I strongly encourage you to create a page on the website to house all of that information. But you can measure your traffic during the crisis and how many hits you're getting on that page versus what a normal non-crisis response would be and what the activity on your site looks like absent a crisis. Same thing with your social media activity, right? And measuring sentiment. And all of those technologies, as I mentioned, agility, Cision, critical mention, all of those measure sentiment to an extent, and they can do the same thing with your social media activities. So we can utilize these tools to see, okay, well, we had 1,000 people that responded to our message in our crisis. How many of those responses were positive, neutral, negative, right? Because we want to understand whether or not our messages are resonating with our stakeholders, or if they are coming back and responding negatively, saying, hey, no, you're not doing the right thing. You need to do this. You need to do that. We need to be able to understand what the sentiment is generally amongst the people who are interacting with our content. We can do surveys. We can do focus groups. Surveys in SurveyMonkey are very easy to put together and do, and we can take advantage of the SurveyMonkey technology to do that very, very quickly. We can do the same thing with focus groups. We can do focus groups right here in Zoom or using similar technologies to really quickly and inexpensively gather some really important insight into what may be happening with our brand in terms of the crisis itself and the brand damage that may be occurring. And then just very simply, looking at the news cycle, right? How quickly did we make that story go away, right? And all of our media monitoring and sentiment services are going to be able to help us understand how quickly we shut down the news cycle, right? Was it one 24-hour cycle? Was it 2 days? Was it a week? Was it a month? How quickly, because of the messaging that we're putting out there and the response that we're giving, are we able to shut down the news cycle? Remembering, right, news thrives on controversy and chaos, right? If it bleeds, it leads. And so one of our goals always with crisis communications plans is, right, how quickly can we make that story go away? I mentioned some of these, listening and media management, and the things that we can do with these kinds of tools. So multi-channel monitoring, right, that can have a global reach if you have a global organization. You can get alerts in real time with these monitoring tools, as opposed to just using Google, which is great, but it's slow. If you need real-time alerts to what is going on in the midst of a crisis, Google's not going to do you much good. It's just not simply fast enough. But you can also utilize these in terms of tracking certain keywords that are relevant to your crisis situation, using various capabilities, whether it's a good old-fashioned Boolean search or if you're using natural language capabilities. Again, sentiment analysis. We can utilize these tools for advanced detection and understanding of what direction the sentiment may be going as our crisis unfolds. And then very importantly, of course, data analytics and reporting. And these tools have customizable dashboards that can give us a lot of really good data as our crisis is unfolding. It also allows us to have a look at what our competitors and our peer companies might be doing if we need to compare our response against how other companies may have responded to a similar situation. But you can also utilize these tools to really understand who your key opinion leaders are and who the influencers are, right? Those social media monitoring tools are going to help you identify the people that have an important voice in the industry that you're in or with your organization. They can also give you access to some great workflow management tools, collaboration. They're going to archive data for you. So if you need to go back and look at, what happened 2 years ago or 5 years ago when we had a similar incident, we're going to be able to draw that historical data and learn some lessons from what happened previously that are going to help drive better decision-making going forward. You may need language and translation capabilities. You may have organizations in a lot of different countries. You're working in a lot of different languages. You could just be in one state and still have to deal with a lot of different languages. So a lot of different ways that we can utilize the technology that's available out there to help us engage, to listen, to understand what our stakeholders are thinking, what they're saying, and how they understand the response that we are making as we put our crisis messaging out there. There's actually a few crisis management applications that are very broad based, do a lot of different things. And this is my 2 minutes of shameless self-promotion. Institute for Crisis Management has a strategic relationship with a company called Rock Dove Solutions, and they have an app out there called In Case of Crisis. And it is a kind of a multifunctional platform. And so I've talked a little bit about this threat intelligence, risk intelligence. It's built into the platform. It already monitors 14,000 intelligence channels across the globe. You can build out custom dashboards to scan the environment for particular things. You can set up what kinds of alerts you want to get when things are happening out in the world. You can include your own company's physical plants and assets and locations when you're setting up that custom dashboard. You can engage with a mass notification tool that includes push channel, SMS, email. It's got an incident reporting function for your crisis management team. You can use it anywhere, anytime, on any device. It provides views based on people's roles, so you can determine and set up who sees what, right? Who has the ability to go in and log an incident or respond to an incident, what they get to see based on their role in the company and in the crisis management team. Then you can put interactive protocols in there so that everybody is getting a checklist of what their tasks are, the things that they are expected to do throughout the crisis. You can run meetings, resolve issues. You can track emerging issues. You can change severity levels of crises real time as they happen. You can collaborate cross-team and cross-department within the application itself. It can hold a library of holding statements of crisis communication playbooks for each scenario that you've developed. And you can build an actual library in there of all of your tools, but you can also build an archive of the issues that you've responded to over the course of time. You can also go in and with a few clicks of the mouse, create after action reports. You can generate briefings for executives. You can track all the different reports that have come through, monitor your communications. So It's got a lot of different things built into a pretty broad crisis management platform out there. So kind of wrapping up and giving us some time for a few questions. We've got a lot of technology out there that really helps us work smarter. As I said, there's no substitute for human judgment when it comes to crisis management and crisis communication. But these tools certainly help us to learn more things that we couldn't do before, learn things more quickly, and put a lot of data and information in our hands that is going to help us make better decisions and craft better communication strategies when our organizations are in the midst of a crisis. They really are going to help you drive ROI, right? These days, communications we have to prove our worth. We always have had to prove our worth, but now we have the tools to really show that there is an ROI to effective communications, both day to day and in crisis situations. So it is up to us to utilize the tools that can help prove out the ROI that we all have always known was there. But we can also respond quicker and more nimbly. And we can also do a better job of recovering from crises, getting to that tomorrow's normal more quickly, and most importantly, protecting our organization's reputation. So with that, and you all will have access to this slide deck, by the way. Megan's going to share that with you. I would love to hear from all of you. If you want, come connect with me on LinkedIn. If you want to learn a little bit more about our company, it's crisisconsultant.com. But with that, I'm going to stop the share and open the floor for any questions. And it looks like we've got maybe a few.
Yes, thank you, Deb. Presentation was wonderful. Reminder to everybody, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hand if you'd like. I had a question to kick us off. So when you're using things like AI tools to draft first drafts of messaging, what are some things to consider? And like, how do you know, will it know best case scenario of like how to respond to something like with best practices, or how should you approach that?
The more information you can give it, the better outcome you're going to get, garbage in, garbage out. So you might start with a very general query, but then you can refine it little by little. So one of the things that they suggest you do is start by giving it a persona. So tell the tool, for example, use the persona of a public relations professional in a manufacturing company. I very often say I use the persona of a crisis management consultant. So give it some detail and some context around what you're asking it to do. If you want best practice, ask for best practice. Don't assume, though, that everything that it generates is necessarily correct and truthful, right? Because it is culling through a lot of data. I mean, gazillions of terabytes of data. Some of it's good and some of it's not. And so we can't just use ChatGPT to generate a press release and throw it out there. We really have to police it a little bit and make sure that what we're putting together is accurate.
Great. Does anybody have any questions they want to put into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask?
This is Andrea. I'm curious, as you've been working with as a consultant with various companies, and you provide them with, for example, these are the highest risks that your company should be considering for crises that might occur. What's been the response? Do they wonder, what are your sources for this? How do you know that these really are the top risks, that kind of thing?
Well, that's a great question, Andrea. I don't get a lot of pushback. I think they must think I know a lot of stuff. But a lot of what I use to make that determination comes from them, right? They all complete surveys, and I do follow-up interviews with key members of the team, and I ask them what keeps them awake at night, right? And we score all of those things and put them together. I just did one recently for a new client, for example. And we use a matrix to determine low to high risk and impact. In almost every category, I use 18 different categories of crises. Almost every one of them fell in the basically, no, it's not going to happen. And if it does, it won't be bad. But what that told me was that they were a very optimistic group of people, or they were really, had their head in the sand, right? If they thought that they had absolutely no risk for cybercrime, for example. And so we use a combination of input from them, the data that I pull from some of these tools. I do deep dives on media. Some of you may be aware, I don't think I sent to you, Megan, but I will, our annual crisis report. So we've been putting out a report for 34 years that's all about crises in the news. And so I do a deep dive into our own database of millions of crisis news stories, and can come back and tell them, okay, here's what happens to other companies in your space. All right, so based on that history, I'm able to help predict what kinds of things they need to be prepared for.
One follow-up question for that. How can you go about communicating, maybe for executives that aren't as receptive to their communication staff as kind of being an essential part of crisis response? How can you kind of leverage your expertise as a communications professional to executives that may not think it's as important to loop those folks in addition to other members of their leadership team?
You know what? Go to the data. I talked a little bit about ROI. One of the things that gets the attention of the C-suite is numbers, right? We don't want to talk about what we might consider the warm and fuzzy part of communication, but we have to deliver hard data that shows what can happen when we do X or what happens when we do Y, right? And being knowledgeable about our business, about our company, and about our risks, right? It's about being good business people first and communicators second, right? So we need to know our business inside and out, understand where the risks are, and be able to demonstrate that through the kinds of data that we can put together to really illustrate, here's what happens when we don't do anything. Here's what happens when we respond in a best practice kind of way. Other questions?
Yeah,
Come on, guys.
I was curious if you have any examples of when you came up with a risk list, and then some kind of crisis happened, and the company you were consulting for responded to the crisis. Did they use the mitigation measures that you delivered to them? And if so, how did that go?
Usually they do, right? Because they pay good money to get those plans in place. And I'm of the mind that when crisis response or crisis communication goes badly, it's because executives either got bad advice from their communications team, or they ignored good advice. And I can tell you that more often than not, it is them ignoring good advice. Great example, though, you're probably all familiar with some of the trials and tribulations of United Airlines over the last few years. And they had a huge crisis a few years ago when a passenger was dragged off an airplane. We've all seen that crisis. I thought for a long time that Oscar Munoz, who was CEO at the time, must have ignored good advice from his communications and legal teams. Well, I actually saw him speak at a conference this past summer, and he talked at length about that incident. And it turns out that he got bad advice. He didn't ignore good advice. He got bad advice from legal and from the comms team. And that really kind of contributed to how they stumbled the first several days of that crisis. And finally, when he made the decision that he was going to basically do the right thing, he did it to the shock and horror of the communications and the legal teams who stood behind the camera watching him do live interviews with major news networks. But it worked. it took a couple of weeks to get there, but when he finally decided, no, that's not the way that this is going to go, we're going to do the right thing. And it finally made it go away. So that was just a really powerful example to me, and something that truly changed my mind about how I thought things had kind of transpired at United. Can anyone here share how you've used technology in comms planning or execution? Andrea, that's a great question. Anybody else want to chime in? What are you using in your day-to-day work?
And feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't be shy. We're communicators. We're not shy. Nobody wants to talk today, ladies. Oh, yay, Jocelyn. Can you repeat the question? What kinds of tools or tech are you using currently in your roles? Oh, still trying to gain the trust. Kimberly, we should talk.
I will say I personally have benefited from the Institute for Crisis Management training and couldn't recommend whether it's that organization or another organization to complete that with. As a communicator, gives you best practice guidelines to kind of, if you do have a distrustful executive team about whether they're not taking that seriously, it's a great opportunity.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, she was a student of mine a few years back. And one of the things I'll send to you, by the way, Megan, to share with this group is a coupon code. Our next class is starting online in April of 2025. And I will send you a coupon code. So anyone who participated today, if they're interested in going through our online crisis communications management certification course, and you could save $250. So I'll be happy to send that over as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Megan will provide that in the materials she sends afterwards that come out to everyone who registered.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. And on a flip side of it, I do encourage you to, seek me out on LinkedIn and connect. I love to have conversations with other communications professionals. I'm more than happy to do a sanity check. If you've got an issue or something and you want to bounce it off of me or get a little bit of input or advice, I'm always welcome to those kinds of conversations. Just kind of part of what I try to do to give back to our profession that has given me so much.
Appreciate that. And we just got a question coming in from Joe. Was there any reason for the bad advice that the United CEO received? What was the thought process that if they stayed quiet, the story would fall out of the news cycle?
I don't really have a good answer to that. Oscar didn't talk about that. I do know there was some turnover in the communications team after that occurred. And maybe that was what they were thinking, but because the very first communication that came from United after that incident supported the employees and actually kind of trashed the victim. They shared some things they learned about the victim. His name is Dr. Dow. In his past, trying to make themselves look good and make him look like a bad customer, and that backfired badly, very badly. And it was pretty quickly after that, less than 24 hours after that, that we started seeing a little bit of improvement in the messaging. But yeah, I don't know what they were thinking. Because if I had been their consultant, certainly that would not have been what I would have recommended they do.
Yeah, now that just shows up as a case study in PR training.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's way too many good case studies in aviation. Boeing being a really big one these days. I know some of you are very familiar with Boeing out in that neck of the woods. That company is struggling mightily, just trying to come back from the strike and all of the incidents that they've had with aircraft. They still haven't really recovered from the crashes from 2018 and 2019, right? 5-6 years ago, and they are still struggling.
You lost thousands of people right before Christmas.
Yeah.
So I want to be a PR person there. I see that Michael has joined us and has unmuted herself. Did you have a question? And we also have one from Jill after that.
Great.
Hi, Deb. I'm in Boise, so hello. And I actually took the crisis certification class through PRSA probably before COVID, so a long time ago. And the United was an example. And I think it was a video by passengers that came out 2 or 3 days after the initial comm started.
Yeah.
And it's so true. Even today, somebody always has a video of what actually takes place. So it was.
And we're not afraid to use them.
No. And then there was another airlines case that was the Miracle on the Hudson, and talked about how airlines know the risk, and like 90% of the time it's pilot error, and they had to prove that it wasn't pilot error. It was fascinating. I don't work in that field. I work in the event and convention center space. So I just wanted to, add to your story. So thank you.
Well, thanks. Miracle on the Hudson. Boy, if you really want to know that story, go watch the movie Sully, starring Tom Hanks. They put the pilot and the co-pilot through the ringers, trying to force them to prove that they didn't make a mistake, and using simulator data. And Sully turned it around on them in an amazing way, and proved that the actions that he took were the best possible outcome for all of the passengers on that plane. And he didn't lose a single one. Great story.
Jump to another question by Jill. We're getting close to our closure time, but she asked, would you suggest any good resources for creating an initial crisis management plan for a company? And I know you're going to be providing us some resources after this, so maybe it's part of that, but turn it over to you, Deb.
Yeah, gosh, I can't tell you how many crisis management and communication books I have on my bookshelves, because I buy every one that I find. There are lots of different good ones. I will put together a recommended reading list, and I'll share that with Megan to share with you on some books that I've thought were particularly well done. The one thing I can say, though, is I don't think there is a fill in the blank out of the box crisis plan out there that's worth whatever you might pay for it. Every plan really has to be unique to your organization, to your culture, to your leadership team. There are certain similarities in the content of what those plans ought to be, but everyone really needs to be unique to your organization. But I'll share a list of a few books that I've found to be pretty good.